Welcome to another episode of the B2B Founder Podcast. I'm your host, Brett Trainer. Today, I welcome Anthony Coundouris to the show. Anthony is the founder and author of the book Run Frictionless. Anthony has been designing and building sales systems for startups for well over a decade. Based on his experiences, he has written an easy-to-read book that founders and marketing teams can grasp. Run Frictionless will guide you on how to design a sales system using a framework he developed called the 4 Qs. Doesn't matter the type of startup, the methodology works with any type of business. We dig into all this, the 4 Qs, how to apply it, how to leverage it in your business, and so much more. So if you're a founder or business owner that is struggling to get out of the primary sales role, this episode and this system was for you. Enjoy, and as a reminder, if you listen to this podcast, please subscribe on your favorite platform and share it with your friends and colleagues that might enjoy it as well. Thank you for listening, and now onto the interview. Hello, Anthony. Welcome to the podcast.
Hey there, Brett. Thank you very much for having me on board.
It's great to have you. Appreciate you taking the time. As we were talking offline, you had me at the title of your book, Run Frictionless, but we'll get into that in a second. No, but like I said, I was super thrilled to have you on the program because we don't talk to a lot of folks about the sales process, and we talk about revenue growth, but most people don't have a plan or a system for it. So definitely want to dig into that today. But before we go too deep, maybe share with the audience what you're working on today, who you're working with, and then we can get into it.
Yeah, thank you, Brett. Well, what's been occupying my time for the last fortnight is creating a playbook. In fact, we just released our playbook today. So the book, Run Frictionless, which you've read, Brett, is more like on a conceptual level, just to explain the theory and the framework. What we're really focusing on now is helping folks DIY the execution. And so the playbook's been very instrumental. It's been in the making now for a while because what we've been doing is we've been watching how our customers use our playbooks during a service we have called a friction tune-up, where we get on like very much like we're doing now, a 1-hour session. We do some design thinking, and we use a playbook as a means to describe the kinds of changes we want to make in their business using the 4 Qs. So we've kind of culminated all that learning and tried to create a playbook where hopefully more people can DIY the 4 Qs.
Yeah, it's interesting. We can get into the number of DIY versus folks that need help. I mean, I love the concept of DIY, but I think most people need that help, right? That facilitator, the teacher, if you will, to get it. So, I do want to get into the book, and the playbook sounds like it's, going to be super interesting as well. So maybe to kick us off, why'd you write the book? I mean, I think I have an idea, but I'd love to hear from you. What kind of led you down the path to write it?
Well, when I sold my second startup, I've done, 2 startups myself. So I know the pain and the misery and the fortune that goes with it. But after that, I started to spend the last sort of 4 or 5 years just building sales systems. So I'm one of those guys that just goes into a company and builds the process from the ground up, from A to Z. And the challenge that you have when you're trying to introduce a process is that a lot of the times people don't understand the concepts. They don't understand what you're bringing. And it takes like 30 days just to teach people the basic concepts before you even really get started. And sometimes they only give you 3 months to show results, right?
Right. Especially in sales, that can be really difficult. It takes some time. Yeah.
Yeah, you lose 30% of your time trying to explain the concepts and going around in circles with the thought. So I think it was 2014, 15. I said, right, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to put my mind down into paper form so that I can give this to a customer before I begin that consultation work and say, hey, please read this. It doesn't take very long. It's pretty simple to read. Read it first. And then if you like the content and you agree with the direction, then call me and let's work together.
Yeah, it makes sense. And you're so right. I mean, even working between startups, enterprise companies, just getting 2 departments to speak the same language is really hard. And so if you're introducing a third, vocabulary to it. And so when you started sending that out ahead of time, were you working with, was this back with the startups and founders, or were you working with different groups? Or who was your target when you first started looking at this?
Yeah, it's all pre-revenue businesses. I really took the most difficult end of the market and And I noticed that a lot of like business coaches, like people who are kind of in a similar field as like I'm working in, won't touch these guys. You know, they'll say, look, we only work with businesses that do a minimum of 500,000 a year. So I started working with companies that were all pre-revenue. I don't know why, but I
You like the
did.
challenge.
It must be, or maybe I'm just a sucker for pain. I just enjoyed that, and that's really where the growth has been. But subsequently, it's expanded a little bit further, and we're getting now into like the 130, the 150 people businesses where you're talking more about high growth startups.
Yeah, and it makes sense. And we were talking a little bit offline before. I spent 25-year career between startups and enterprise, and enterprise has the same challenge that you solved with your book and the playbook that startups have. And I love the idea of getting it in their hands early and building kind of the culture, the DNA around the 4 Qs and this process as you start to grow, versus all of a sudden we've got 50 people or 100 people and they're trying to figure it out. And love to get your perspective too as we dig into this from the founder's perspective, how easy or difficult it's been for you to get them out of the sales process, right? It's hard to get hard to let go. And I'm sure there's no single standard answer for that, but just love your perspective on when you're starting this process, how was that received?
There's a kind of trend that I've noticed with them. If they haven't been able to get themselves out of a sales role by about the second or the third year since the inception of the business, they just start getting tired. And by about the fourth, the fifth year, if they're still making the same mistake, they're already trying to become like chairman. They're trying to throw themselves out of the business as opposed to scaling themselves out of it.
Yeah, I like it.
So what I tend to do is I tend to talk to founders who have been trying for about 2, maybe 3 years, because they really understand the pain. They began to realize that they're getting tired, and that's when they're looking for frameworks and ideas. But to your point earlier, Brett, you were talking about technically led founders.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because a lot of the people who have been very excited about the framework are people who like frameworks, which tend to be technical people, right? Like they like WordPress and they like different frameworks and things like this. So when they hear about a framework, they think that's probably going to be better than the individual efforts of the people without a framework. So CTOs and COOs have been very excited about the 4Qs because I just think that mentally they're looking for frameworks to put into their business.
Yeah, and it makes sense, and process driven, right? You're absolutely right. They engineers, CTOs, technology, it's the process, and it makes sense. And that's kind of the other thing too. When you mentioned the 2 years, if it's not, I think you're starting to hit burnout at that point, right? And I haven't personally worked with a company that's been able to scale where the founder is still involved in the selling process. They may be, for super big, large enterprise deals, you may help close, but if they're active in the sales process, they're not scaling. And again, if they don't want to be, they want to be still fine. But something tells me your customers and your readers are not the ones that are happy to be in the sales process. Is that fair?
Yeah, it is. And I think as a shareholder, I'd be a little bit concerned in the business because, what's the value of a sale that's made where it requires the founder to close the sale or to create the sale? Like, really, what's the value of that sale? I think the value of the sale is when somebody else other than them can close the deal without them. I think now you're talking about a valuable sale.
Yeah, 100% agree with you on that. And it gets harder, right? Because the founder and they're very passionate about their product, and it's just through pure excitement and enthusiasm they can get some sales. But how do you translate to the first guy you're bringing on, or gal or woman, to help sales? They're not going to have that same passion for your product. Hopefully they see the value of the product, but I think that's really where the value of your system comes into place, is having a clear process that as you bring salespeople on, or just anybody that can help with the sale, there is a playbook for them to follow.
Yeah, no, I think that's the idea because, you were describing it before as being almost like sort of black art, where it's you just keep trying to hire the right salesperson to make the sale. And I think we need a lot more predictability. And that's what's interesting about your podcast. I like it because you're talking about ideas about how to introduce predictability as opposed to like these tips and tricks which work for a while, but I think we need way more robust means of knowing that we can reach predictable revenue.
Yeah, no, that's so true. And I used to have the tagline in the early days. People have been listening from the beginning would know, it's a no hacks approach to growth, right? Because there's some shortcuts you can take, but it's not
Yeah.
sustainable. So maybe that's a good segue into, and again, we don't have to go super deep, so people will actually go out and buy your book and then find the playbook and reach out to you for help. But I think it would be a really good exercise to kind of go through the 4 Qs. I may have a few follow-up questions that I've been saving since I read the book, but I think that would be really a good help. At least people would have an understanding what the framework looks like. They've heard us talking about it. So are they thinking, is this something I can really do, or do I have, what I'm saying? So let's get into at least the core concepts of the book.
Yeah, sure. So the 4Qs is a decision-making framework, and it's designed to help sales teams or the founder of the organization scale their organization, their business. And 4Qs because there are indeed 4 quadrants. Quadrant 1 addresses whom we serve, and the remaining 3 quadrants deal with what we are serving, the customer, what we share in common with the customer, and how we serve the customer. So the first quadrant is really primarily focused on customer profiles, who we serve. Second quadrant is really looking at the product, what we serve the quadrant 1. Quadrant 3 you raised earlier, which is interesting, which is who we are, which is a much deeper question. And then the last quadrant is how we serve. So this is more about the interactions or the experience. How does it feel like to become a customer of your business?
Yeah, and that's where I go back to time. Love the title of frictionless. All right, hopefully their interactions with you is frictionless. They get through, clean, smooth. They have a great experience. And it's interesting when you're talking about the pre-revenue, and if you're looking at Quadrant 1, who's our customer profile? That's got to be an interesting conversation or exercise. And is it more because you can't really talk to the customers per se? I guess you can talk to the people who you're think serving. Can maybe give us an idea of how you tee that up, or how you walk through Quadrant 1 to help them make sure they're aligned with the right customers.
Yeah. So it really is a series of tests. And I think one of my greatest criticisms of startups is when one of their challenges, if you may, is to get a Quadrant 1, Quadrant 2 fit. You want to be able to look at the features, the limitations, and the workarounds in Quadrant 2 and find the customer who you ought to be serving in Quadrant 1. So in a sense, what you've got, imagine, Brett, you've got like a stick and you're trying to fit this piece of timber into a piece of furniture, right? You can spend all your time in Quadrant 2 building product and shaving that end of that piece of wood, only to discover later that the other end doesn't fit anyway. So you can waste millions of dollars in your shareholders' money burning it away in Quadrant 2, when in actual fact, a lot more work could have be done by the salespeople. So here's a really simple way that they can start making headway into Quadrant 1. And that is, one really simple practice would be, from every sales call, every sales interaction that the salespeople make, they have to bring away one piece of intelligence to help make the next sale easier.
Yeah.
And we set up a ticketing system in one organization. It was awesome. So they had a ticketing system, very much like Jira or Trello or anything like that. Yeah. What would happen is that the salespeople are obliged that each time they have an interaction with a customer, they've got to try and give back some intelligence to the organization to help qualify better what's going on in Quadrant 1.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic. It's like kind of the customer service calls, right, with dispositions, right? So this is why they called, and here's it. So you get a better idea of who's calling in about one, because if you just ask the salesperson afterwards, well, why don't people buy? The price is too high. Maybe you might be right, but there's probably, I love that idea of putting some research in behind and learning from everything, right? You're putting in the time, you're not scaling yet. You might as well take advantage of every one of those calls that you're making. I'm guessing that's a shift for some of these founders as they're starting to go through this process, right? Is there a little culture shock when they do this, or does it make the light bulb go off and go, aha, this makes sense?
Yeah, if it's a situation where there's at least one person in the organization who can consistently make sales, you're talking about a much easier problem to solve, right? Because it's really about studying their behavior and then replicating it. But if you're in a situation where nobody is making sales, so I've dealt with some pre-revenue organizations where not even the founder is actually making headway, selling product. What you've got there is there's no point talking about sales commissions, because actually the role of the salespeople is not to make a sale. It's to teach the organization how to make a sale.
Yeah, I always used to say it's to help the customer or the buyer facilitate the buying process, but I like that too, help them learn. Yeah, there's way too many that it is about the quota and making the sale and hitting the number, and nobody's getting smarter doing that, right? The good salespeople are getting richer, but the organization's not getting any smarter.
Yes. And I think as well, the interesting part of Quadrant 2 is that if you do it smart, like what way I suggested in the book, which is you have the customer who you serve today and the customer profiles that you serve tomorrow. So you get as one operations person told me, he said, he believes that the Quadrant 1, Quadrant 2 fit is actually the responsibility of the product owner. Very interesting. In this organization, when we rolled it out, he was saying, no, it's actually Quadrant 1 is not going to be the responsibility of the salespeople. It's the responsibility of the product owner. And so what he did was he got the product people to spend less time in Quadrant 2 and started building them into the interactions to get first-hand intelligence from Quadrant 1. So back to your point, how you were saying before, the salespeople come running in and say, they don't like the price. They don't like the features. Well, the product owner can't deal with that, right? That's meaningless intelligence. So because their livelihood is on the line, they're going to dig a little deeper, right, to find out exactly what the problem is.
Yeah, no, 100%. And I was just looking for a quote that I think came from you, which was along the line of what you just said. The purpose of the sales system is not to save company time and money. The aim is not to make the sales system more efficient, but to help customer achieve their goal in the shortest amount of time. And I read that, I'm like, sold, right? It's such a different way of thinking about it. But when you change that mindset, it makes so much more sense, right? The old days, the hard sell, the used car salesman, this car is going to be gone in 2 days. You have to buy it now. It just doesn't work. Maybe it does limited time, but back to our point, it's not sustainable or scalable. So if you can get them to think differently, I think that was your quote, right? I heard that from you somewhere.
I don't know if I quoted anybody else, Brett, but yeah.
Well, I'm giving you the credit for that one too. So, and the other interesting thing that I've heard you talk about, or was in the book, was selling tomorrow, which I think would that fit into Quadrant 2, not into Quadrant 3 yet. It's just around the product and don't sell what you don't have. Maybe we get into that a little bit. I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah. So, it's when you read bad customer reviews, when customers say bad things about companies, they find it very hard to articulate this concept, this idea of future self. But it's essentially when you've been told, because a lot of salespeople will say yes, yes, yes to everything, because they don't spend enough time in Quadrant 2 reading the fact sheets and thinking about the limitations, and then trying to say to myself, okay, well, if I understand these limitations of the product today, who is the best match in Quadrant 1, for it? Instead, what they'll do is that they'll try to future sell the product and just say, well, it can be done, yes, 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 only to create a moving target. Right. Where then what happens in Quadrant 2 now is that the customer will wake up during the onboarding process or at some point, after the transaction, they'll say, look, you sold me on this. This would be here. It's not. So guess what? This is now conditional. The sale is conditional to this feature. I won't pay. I'll just wait, take as long as you need, and I won't buy it until you build the feature. So they're really putting the organization in a difficult position now because they're hijacking their product roadmap.
Yeah, and especially when you're smaller and growing, that's almost impossible to overcome, or it just creates so many other barriers because then you got the product team trying to figure out which one's the most important so I can close that sale. And, I know I tie it back to enterprise sometime, but this is where I think smaller companies and startups have the advantage because they can build some of the biggest failures of larger organizations. I've been with companies where marketing will position one way, sales will sell it this way. You try to onboard them with features that sales promise that they don't have. So they're already dissatisfied by the time they even get to the customer success team. And don't even get me started that the customer thought they dealt with 4 different organizations or companies as they went through that process. And that just really resonated with when we talk about that said, hey, this is where we're at now. Let's find the customers that this makes sense for. They can grow with us, but here's how we're going to solve this problem today. And if it's not for them, then that's not maybe the right Q1 customer, right?
Yeah, exactly. Or what you could be doing is that at least you're making them aware of the limitation, anticipating, and that they're going to hit this limitation, right? It's like when they come back to you and they'll say, oh, come on, like, my business. You knew I was going to need this. You didn't tell me you didn't have it, right? So naming features in quadrant 2 is simply not enough anymore. We need to name the limitations, map those limitations to quadrant 1, and then also be considerate around workarounds, because even Google, with a market cap of 1 billion, names workarounds all the time with their products,
True.
So I think it's okay. Workarounds are a fact of life. And if the salespeople are thinking about not just about features, but limitations and workarounds, right in that first meeting that they're having with the customer, they can table those limitations and those workarounds very quickly and in a very mature manner.
Yeah, and set the expectation, right? A lot of companies don't do very well. Okay. That makes a lot of sense. I may circle back to something in quadrant 2, but quadrant 3 to me was the most fascinating, probably the one we could have almost done a full episode just on Q3, the who we are. So maybe for the audience, just give us your perspective and take on what Q3 is, and maybe we can dig in a little bit. Because I think if you can get this right, it's going to help really. You can make some mistakes in Q1, Q2, and Q4 if you get Q3 right, which probably no one's ever 100% right, but I think striving for. So I'll kick it back to you to kind of give us your perspective on that.
That's very perceptive, Brett. There is one of my grievances with frameworks, and I researched a lot of them before I wrote the 4 Qs, was they would stick you in fixed starting position. They say you have to begin at this point. But one of the cute things about the 4 Qs is you don't have to begin your journey in quadrant 1. You can move sequentially, but a lot of people like to begin, say, in quadrant 3. And I've had a lot of more like CX, DX people that actually want to begin their journey in quadrant 4, right?
Yeah.
So it's good that you're thinking about quadrant 3, because I tell you what, if I was to redo Run Frictionless as a business, and we operate on the 4 Qs, so we use the 4 Qs product in our own company. But if I were to redo it again, I think that I would spend less time getting a quadrant 1, quadrant 2 fit at the beginning of our journey, and I would have gone for a quadrant 1, quadrant 3 fit. And to give the viewers an understanding of why, like, okay, what is quadrant 3? Well, who we are. There's essentially 2 levels to it. One is the identity of the organization. So it's about how you can consistently brand yourselves through every touch point which occurs in quadrant 4. So that's just the first kind of cursive level. But the deeper, more sinister level is the shared belief, and whether you ever strike a shared belief with quadrant 1. Because what we found was in our research was, yes, it's true that customers make rational buying decisions between quadrants 1 and 2. They look at the features, the limitations, and the workarounds, and then they try to compare that with other vendors to make the most informed buying decision. But we've found that even in B2B sales, we're discovering that the irrational buying forces of quadrant 3 really kick in, especially towards the end game of the sale, where everybody in quadrant 2 starts to look the same, and people sit around the table and they say, well, who stood out for you? Now you're talking about quadrant 3, who we are.
Yeah, I think I read your quote, 70% of the buying decisions are made out of Q3, right? If that doesn't wake you up or open your eyes, you should be paying attention to this. And it makes sense, right? Because as we talk about, to your point, and I've got an oversimplistic view of, if you look at your problem and your go-to-markets, right? What problem are you solving for the customer? How do you solve it? How do you solve it differently? And you have the proof points, but that's almost to your point. It's hard to defense that unless you're different is really different and you've come up with a unique way. But unless you can wrap in, who we are as part of that different, I think that's when it gets really powerful.
Yeah.
And it's controllable. But if you don't get Q1 and Q2 right, and there's only 6 people that care about the who we are, you're not going to scale it. But I don't think there's that many people that actually pay attention to the Q3 and who we are, and that's where a lot of the value comes. And I know Q4 with the execution process, 100%, you got to get that right. If they have a bad experience, they're not coming back. But as you're trying to get other people, at least as this is what I took out of your book, as you're trying to get new people into the organizations to sell, your product or solutions, you've got to get them internally as part of the who we are, so they can, with confidence, right, sell that to the customer base. And it's not just features and benefits. Here's our price. I got to make 3 sales to get it. So I don't know if you've got any magic sauce that helps people really get to that who we are in Q3. I'd love to maybe have you dig in a little bit on that and, how you ended up on that as part of the process. I know it's a very broad question, but just kind of curious how you got there and how you help companies get there, I guess, is even probably the more helpful point.
Right. How I got there was very easy to answer. What I noticed was when we were designing pitch decks for organizations, we started spending more time at the beginning of the pitch talking about who we are. So maybe 5 slides, and then another 25 slides, we would then go into the product, about the benefits and how that ties back to the organization and their company. But the most important thing is that I would teach the salespeople, if you don't capture their imagination, their attention in the first 5 slides, the product won't matter. They'll never buy anyway. Don't worry about quotes. Don't worry about features. In fact, just pack up and leave, because there really won't be a sale. You will push the square into the triangle. You think you'll cheat yourself into believing that you're going to sell by using those hard tactics you described earlier, but you won't sell this product, because if they're receiving glazed eyes or you are met with hostility, which quite often when people don't share your belief, they're hostile. Right? They'll tell you to get out of the office. I don't believe this stuff you're talking about. You want to get to that quadrant 1, quadrant 3 fit as early as possible. So one of the things that you can do is building qualifying questions right back in the early game, where you may ask like 1 or 2 questions which seem irrelevant to the customer, but actually are testing whether or not they believe. And then don't let these people into your company, because you're just wasting the time of your salespeople dealing with people who, by the way, you cannot change. Because we've done tests with our market research people where we tried to convert non-believers. We said, how much would it cost an organization to convert somebody who didn't have a quadrant 1, quadrant 3 fit? What would it take? So we got 2 fellas, right? The 2 top salespeople in a company, and we devoted their time to dealing with people who don't believe. Okay, so in this organization, the whole belief about the companies around compliance and the importance of compliance. So their customers come to them because, man, we believe in compliance. We need this for our enterprise business, right? But there's a group that don't believe in compliance. Maybe they believe in price, or maybe they believe in something else, right?
Yeah.
So we said, what could we do? And I said to them, look, I want you to just beat them over the head every single day. Don't talk about the product. Don't talk about the quote, and just get on the phone every day and say, we need to talk about your beliefs. Where are you with this? Have you changed since we last spoke? Let's try again. Let me try another angle. And we tried and tried and tried. And guess what? We only converted 5% of non-believers, man. We went like, holy crap, a quadrant 1, quadrant 3 fit. If you don't get this right, you are in a lot of trouble.
You get a very expensive sales cycle too, right? At only a 5%. No, that's so true. And I think we've all had those customers that we've chased and we know I can convert them, right? They're close to seeing the value. They like me, but 2 years later, we're still this close to closing it. But the fact is they never really saw the full value of what and had that shared vision of it. So, and I think this is perfect framework for companies that are, frankly, would work at the enterprise, but you're convincing a lot of different people and changing fundamental beliefs. But, man, if you can get this right up front, I think your traction and your momentum and taking the friction out of the process is going to help accelerate some of that growth.
Yeah.
Should easily.
And then that way, we cannot have the shared beliefs is inside out. So you cannot go out to customers and the public and say, this is what we stand for. And then when you come back inside the company, talk about something completely different. It's got nothing to do with that. It doesn't work like this. It really is the very truth. And if there's one question that you can ask yourself, even in your own business, Brad, it's simply this. If you're trying to find what your belief is, if you're trying to seek it, just ask yourself, if you didn't make any money today, what would be your motivation to go to the office? And then that becomes then the underlying basis for whom you hire, because those salespeople or the customer service people, what would be, if we didn't pay you today, what would be the reason why you would want to come to the office? And hopefully everybody's talking a very similar belief. And then that belief will start to perpetuate into the quadrants 1, 2, and 4 throughout all of your decision making. And so when you start talking about how to scale yourself out of the business, if you can get a quadrant 1, quadrant 3 fit, your life is going to be so much easier now because people's decisions in those other quadrants become so much better. And something you said earlier was about the power of how when you get a quadrant 1, quadrant 3 fit, it influences the product you build in quadrant 2. You see, the problem with quadrant 2 is it's not defensible. You know, we can reverse engineer out and figure out your product. We'll go and read it. I know because I teach people to do it. You know, we go and read your terms and conditions. We read your FAQs. We do the fake demos. We figure out what's going on. But if you really want to confuse competitors, if you can take quadrant 3 and then start to direct the build in quadrant 2 based on your beliefs, you confuse the crap out of them. I've got no idea what's going on.
Yeah, that's so true. And that's where we get back to how are we different, right? And so much, because if you're going to base your business model on we're better, man, you've got to be 100x better, and because everybody's better than everybody else. Yeah. And just a question I had before we get into Q4 is, as we're seeing with COVID and the move, we've seen B2B especially moving towards digital, right? It's been slow, and we're a unique snowflake. Our industry is not digital. Well, everybody's going to be there now. So where I've seen success is when these companies are then able to articulate, the Q3, Q1 online, right? It's one thing if you and I are having a conversation, we can get into it. So have you had any recommendations? Maybe this is book 2, how to take that messaging from, the person to person to the online, where I may come into your website and I want to make sure that who we are is coming across within what we're doing digitally. That makes sense. I said a whole lot of words.
Oh, no, it's quite accurate. And so what you can do there, I can think of like a broad approach, which is your quadrant 3, quadrant 4 fit. So what happens is that when you write the brand guidelines of the company, its branding guidelines, you need to think about the belief, and you need a sentence for the belief, like one sentence. It needs to be distilled with no marketing jargon, written in the most simplistic language you can imagine, okay? And then what you want to then do is when you're writing the content, the words, the pictures, which are going to associate themselves with every interaction, including the website, you want to make sure that you're gathering some of what was in quadrant 3 and injecting it into those interactions, because that's what will make them unique. There is one experience that I've designed in our company that I can tell you about that we're using in a few other organizations like our clients. Specifically, has got nothing to do with quadrant 2. It's got nothing to do about transactions. We're not selling. It's called a sharing session. And what happens is that it's a means of us to test whether or not we share this belief with another organization. It's done online, and it's designed to be a sharing session. So what happens is that you are expected to communicate, and so it's not a one-way presentation. It's like we're talking to our audience, but they're reciprocating their experiences at different points. And we're starting to gather not only their level of sophistication, but if they are not engaging with us and enjoying this sharing session, we're not going to be serving them later. We're just, it's over.
It's not a good fit. Cut ties, right? It save time, both everybody's time. It's not going to be and just kind of a follow-up to that. I know I'm going back to the sales. So if you're looking at recruiting folks, my belief is that the traditional profile of a sales rep has changed, right? Give me a good problem solver, a facilitator, and somebody that's empathetic is going to still have to have the DNA to ask for the money at the end of the day, right? Hey, if we solve this problem, do we have a deal? But have you started to see and coach some of these founders on the type of talent they're looking for, or how do you approach the people side of this?
One part of it is Tony Hsieh kind of opened up my thinking. The former CEO of Zappos, he wrote a book called Delivering Happiness. And in that book, what he was talking about was hiring first based on culture and then on technical. And then what he would do is during subsequent reviews, like let's just say we hired you, right, Brett? Like 3 months later, we don't just talk to you again about technical, about your ability to sell or your ability to do market research, but talking about your fit culturally. And so in this situation, in the context of the 4Qs, applying that means that we're hiring first based on beliefs, because we've already figured out we can't change your beliefs.
Right.
It's set in stone. Don't forget about it. It's not going anywhere. This is the person that they are, right? But we can technically improve you. We can send you on training courses. We can change all these other aspects. We can make you a better SEO fella or girl, but we cannot change your beliefs. So I think one of the interesting parts is through the recruitment process is how do you find people who are likely to share your belief? And so that I think is a big question for the CEO, because when they're trying to get a quadrant 1, quadrant 3 fit, they're not just looking for customers to say, I believe. They're looking for partners and staff. And I saw a really good example of this when I was working at PAM. So I helped those guys build a sales process. They're a software as a service business in Australia, very successful wayfinding business. What we would see is in 1 out of 10 conversations we'd have with a customer, the customer would turn around and say, could I join your organization? Not only did we strike a quadrant 1, quadrant 3 fit, but they were like, I so believe in what you're describing that I'll leave what I'm doing right now and join your organization.
Yeah, 100%. And I can't say that it was purely a strategic decision on my part, but some of the best folks that I've hired and people I've had on team has been that fit first and took chances on people that may not have had experience in that role. And they were fantastic. I'd almost take a team of those people, and maybe it's just finally catching up, right? That we no longer just have to do the job we have to do the job we're hired for, but the way we think about roles and functions in organizations, especially on the go-to-market, I think is changing. Give me the good customer, empathetic person first every time. We'll figure out how to, we'll do the rest. So I know we're starting to run short on time, and we have not covered Q4 yet, which is important, which most organizations don't. So maybe, if you want to give us a few highlights from Q4, and I don't want to shortchange it and make it sound like it's not important, because it all comes down to the execution there. But yeah, maybe just give us a quick your overview of Quadrant 4.
Sure thing, Brett. So, Quadrant 4 happens to be my favorite quadrant, whether I'm working in that in my business or I'm helping a client. I love Quadrant 4 because Quadrant 4 is how we serve, okay? And so specifically, it's like the precise set of interactions required to create a customer. Okay. So you know how you go into a business sometimes, Tom does it one way, Jill sells another way. And what you want instead is you want to get everybody consistently working on exactly the same blueprint, because that way people can then isolate and identify together which ones work and which ones don't. And so that feedback loop is so much stronger if you've only got one variant which you're operating on, as opposed to many, many different variants.
Yeah, no, and that makes sense. And do you apply that across, again, I'm still more of an advocate of don't think of sales and marketing as sales and marketing. It's really, again, I'm going back to buyer enablement, right? How do we help that process? And so I guess where I'm going is from a tactical standpoint, are you looking at kind of the tasks that go across the buying process or the sales process? And then looking at what are the key activities that take place. And then maybe we'll figure out who's the person responsible for it. So it's really understanding what needs to take place at key milestones, or is that a fair way of looking at it?
Yeah. Earlier you were talking about how the goal of the company is not to serve their goal, but to serve the customer's goal in the possible shortest time. So if you cannot wow them with something unique, experiential in quadrant 4, at the very least, serve them in the fastest possible manner, faster than your competitors could. So what you're doing is you have to become very clear. Every interaction must have a purpose and an objective, and it must help do something for the customer so they reach their goal, right? And so you cut away all the fat, get away all the rubbish that's unnecessary, and you get them to where they want to go in the fastest possible manner. That is the minimum requirement for Quadrant 4. If you don't do that, you miss out on a very important data point that we've discovered called customer expiry, because most organizations are not in competition with one another. We found that out in a lot of research where customers didn't buy anything because they decided that the entire industry was so horrendously bad at serving them that they would rather just continue using slate and chalk than put up with these people.
Yeah, it's fascinating and so true, right? To do nothing is sometimes the biggest competition that you have. So yeah, I think that's a mistake a lot of companies make is they don't look at, they think here's my two competitors. This is where we're different and we're better, but they didn't address doing nothing, right? And how your outcome
Yeah.
is better. And I had actually not heard of expiry before. So thank you for the clear. I mean, it makes sense when you explain it. I don't know if that's an Australian word or but I'm going to start using, I keep using some of my other fellow Australian, or not fellow, but yeah, the language. I love the fortnight. So expiry is my new one. And your definition of that is just the customer just don't do anything or what's?
Right. So with customer expiry, the number seems to be different depending on the buying decision that's being made.
Okay.
And so, for example, we've seen customer expiry occur in 11 minutes. And then we've seen it occur, say, in as long as 6 to maybe 12 months, right, for a more sophisticated decision. And 11 minutes is remarkable. Like I worked in a company in the United Kingdom where I helped them build a sales process. And the operations person told me, yes, there are situations where she has seen that the customer will make a decision in 11 minutes. And I went, holy crap. That means that, like, if we're going to design 11 interactions in Quadrant 4, we, by better God, better make sure they get done and executed professionally within 11 minutes. Because now you're thinking about a whole different business, you see. You're not thinking about your competitors anymore because they probably don't know what's going on anyway.
Sure.
Right? And so you're like, wow, we've got a whole different data point now to track to Quadrant 1. So here comes your Quadrant 1, Quadrant 4 fit, which is customer expiry. If you know that number, if you know that they're going to drop off, doesn't matter what happens, come hell high or water, if they can't make a buying decision within 11 minutes or 4 weeks, they're not going to buy from anybody. If you know that piece of intelligence, you can design something really nasty in Quadrant 4. And that's where I've seen companies that do not have superior products, they have inferior products in Quadrant 2, absolutely bollock businesses with better products because they get a Quadrant 1, Quadrant 4 fit. And startups taking on enterprise, this is a war on Quadrant 1 and 4. This is exactly what they're doing to enterprise.
That makes so much sense and so true. And if you can just execute and provide a better experience, the buyers and the multiple buyers in some cases in B2B, right? Some risk mitigation, other you're solving user issues. You can provide that experience in the time. I hadn't really thought about it but it makes so much sense, right? That's a good number to build back from. And if you can execute against that, then again, back to your title, taking friction out of the process and, making it easier for the buyers. That's awesome.
They take a cue, from Quadrant 4. If it's this hard to buy the product, imagine how bad the product will be.
That's so true. Yeah, and I love the fact of the Q1, Q4 to take on the startups because I'm starting to see some momentum, right? Because at least in the States, I'm sure you guys are seeing that over there too, that some of these large legacy B2B orgs, they're not going to be able to pivot, right? They've kind of made some hacks in place to allow, their current employees to work from home and buyers to buy differently than they had been, but they're not fundamentally changing Q4, the Quadrant 4 to align better with how the new process is going to look like because they think they're going back to normal. And so if you've got a great idea, or even not a great idea, same idea, but you think you can execute and bring it to market and get into the customer quicker, I think we're going to see quite a bit of that. To your exact point, it may be an inferior product, but they can provide a much better experience. They're going to win.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
That's awesome. Yeah, Anthony, thank you so much for your time. I still got 2 more questions for you. I have to ask, what's next for you and the company? You had mentioned the playbook is coming out or it came out today. So is that the focus? What's on the short-term horizon for you?
Yeah, the playbook will occupy a little bit of my time coming into August. But I think what's really exciting is we're unveiling the next version of the friction test. You may remember when you were reading through the book, we had done a few friction tests where we try to quantify what friction would look like. It has a quotient, and then we try to measure its accumulation, and then benchmark organizations. Well, we've been really working hard the last 12 months on the next version of the product, and that's coming out pretty soon. So I'm very excited about that.
No, that's awesome. We will definitely have to have you back on when that comes out because it just ties to everything that I believe in taking. This is how these startups are going to win and grow, get to the million, the 10 million is following this type of process, especially around the go-to-market. And last question, and I can let you get your day started, is what is one thing that you would highly recommend? And as I say, it can be personal or professional. What's kind of top of mind for you right now?
Yeah, I think as much as we can as founders, B2B founders, we have to be consistent. And I think being consistent is not easy. And it doesn't necessarily mean not changing, but it means being very aware that you're creating a test and that you may be part of that test and holding everything consistent. Otherwise, the results that we get, they cannot be acted upon if the process itself was never consistent.
Right. No, that's so true. So true. And that's good. That's a unique answer. Haven't had that one before. So
thanks, Brett.
Definitely appreciate your time. I think the audience is going to get a ton of value out of this. Best place for folks to find you, I'll add it to the show notes, but I'll let you kind of best place for people to track you down.
Yeah, they can find me on LinkedIn if they just Google or look at LinkedIn on Anthony Coundouris, or just key in runfrictionless.com. That's pretty quick too.
And I can attest that it's all over the place right now. And I highly encourage you to check out the content. If you go to the book's got its own website, and there's a ton of free content and tools there to help you as well. Like I said, if you're a founder struggling with sales or you're stuck in the business, highly recommend you guys check out this book. So Anthony, appreciate it. Enjoy, stay safe and healthy out there, and we'll catch up with you before too much longer.
Thank you for having me on the B2B Founder Show. Thank you. Take care.
Appreciate it. Take care. Thanks, Anthony. Bye.
All right.